every country has a pretty long history of implementing tariffs for different reasons. The economist Douglas Irwin likes to break it down into 3 eras of U.S. trade policy history. The first era, starting with the beginning of the United States as a sovereign entity, up until the Civil War, was really to collect government revenue. We were a much smaller central government back then. We needed sources of revenue. You didn't have an income tax yet. Then between the Civil War and World War I, you have this era where tariffs as industrial policy to sort of restrict imports coming into the country. And then after World War II, you get sort of this era of what Douglas Irwin calls reciprocity, bidding down tariffs over time. And that's basically the way of making trade deals. And you get things like the GATT, the General Agreement on Trade and Tariffs, later becoming the WTO. And the new system then is something called an MFN, or Most Favored Nation policy, which is if you're selecting a country for MFN tariffs, you are also applying those same tariffs to all of your trade partners. It was a way to more easily bid down tariffs. If the US is going to lower tariffs on, say, Vietnam, you've got to give then everyone else that same rate. The other thing is that it's a lot easier to administrate, right? If you've just got one single tariff level for all countries. And this is something that Trump is starting to push back on. He's talking about now doing reciprocal tariffs, which sounds like it would be simple, but it's going to be really difficult administratively, particularly for a government that wants to cut government workers and government spending. One of sort of the maxims of international trade is that when you open up to free trade, it helps the many at the cost of a few. The rising tide that lifts all boats, and goods become cheaper, and GDP per capita increases and purchasing power increases as countries are able to sort of specialize in those products in which they have a comparative advantage, and that it's win-win in the aggregate. But that, you talked about steel, right? A lot of old steel mills that are not working anymore because they're not profitable. Because once we opened up to globalization, those jobs went elsewhere. And so I sympathize with the diagnosis here, that globalization and economic neoliberalism has left communities in the US behind. If we think Trump truly believes that these left behind communities, which he sees as his constituents, are something he needs to rescue, and he thinks he can use tariffs in that regard, while that diagnosis might be admirable, and the effort also might be admirable, the policy, and particularly the way that the policy is being implemented right now in this chaotic manner, is not going to actually end up helping those communities that Trump says he's going to help with this. I don't think it's his goal to isolate the US economy. I think he might end up doing that by mistake, though. I hope that's not his goal. If that is his goal, he's trying to reimagine a world that no longer exists. People aren't going to want to come back to the table to negotiate the tough trade deals that are actually going to help to address global economic imbalances that have holed out these communities. The world economy is way more deconcentrated than it was in the 1970s or even the 1990s. In the 1970s, Nixon famously placed blanket tariffs on all trade partners of 10%, pretty low. They were meant to be temporary. It was economic statecraft. It was an effort to extract concessions on monetary policy of key trade partners to devalue the dollar. And just across here, right, if you look on the other side of the White House here at the Smithsonian building, that's where they hashed out these Smithsonian Accords. At the time, Nixon said, this is one of the most monumental agreements on monetary policy of our time, and it didn't hold. Countries ended up engaging in sort of monetary policy in self-interested ways. And we ended up in this world of largely floating exchange rate regimes and a relative lack of capital controls, because that became the easiest pathway when there couldn't be another consensus. I like to always highlight to everyone, and especially my students, that that happened at a time when the US was a lot more of a dominant actor in the global economy. We're a much smaller slice of the global economic pie now. So I question the extent to which the US can throw its economic weight around as it used to. And even when it used to, it didn't end up serving the policy goals.